All right, buckle up because we're diving into some seriously dense theological debate today.
Oh yeah, we're talking Libri Carolini specifically book 2.
This thing makes a dictionary look like light reading.
No kidding. But hey, that's why we're here, right? To break it down.
Exactly. So, for anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of tackling this 8th century masterpiece.
Masterpiece is debatable, but it is a fascinating read.
True, true. It was written under Charlemagne and it gets right into the thick of how we even think about the divine.
And spoiler alert, Charlemagne was not a fan of image worship.
Not even a little bit. In fact, he commissioned this whole book to dismantle the arguments in favor of it.
Which is where book 2 comes in.
It's like a theological smackdown, right, from the first chapter?
Oh, absolutely. They come out swinging.
I mean, calling people out for sheer madness just for misinterpreting the Bible.
You got to remember, theological debates back then were a blood sport.
No holds barred.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the author, writing for Charlemagne, doesn't mince words. They're dissecting every single verse that could be twisted to support image worship.
And they keep coming back to this idea of literal versus allegorical interpretation, right?
Huge point of contention.
Yeah.
Right away in chapter 1, they tackle that whole argument about the destruction of Jerusalem.
Which, to be fair, sounds pretty convincing at first glance.
Right. The pro-image folks were like, see, God destroyed Jerusalem because they were worshiping images.
Makes sense until you realize they're talking about the physical temple, not just any old image.
And the Libri Carolini author does not let them off easy.
They basically say, come on, guys, context is key. You can't just cherry pick verses to fit your narrative.
It's a recurring theme throughout the book, actually. And we
Yeah.
see it again with their take on verses about prophets, the whole city of God concept.
It all hinges on how you interpret those terms, right?
Yeah.
Take everything literally in the Bible, and you're in for a wild ride.
No kidding. So much of this comes down to interpretation. And the author's basically saying, here's what these words really mean.
And spoiler alert, it's not an excuse to go build a bunch of statues.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But it's not just these broad interpretations they're going after.
Yeah.
In chapter 4, they get downright personal with this guy named John the Presbyter.
Oh, yeah, John. They call him out by name, too. What's the deal with this John guy? Why was he important enough to warrant a personal takedown?
Well, John was using this one psalm to argue that worshiping at God's footstool meant you could worship images.
The footstool argument. Okay, now I'm curious. What is it about this footstool business?
It was a common argument from the pro-image side,
Right, right.
but the Libri Carolini author was not having it.
So what they say, what's the counter-argument to the whole footstool thing?
Well, they argued it was metaphorical.
Okay, so not a literal footstool you can just go and, like, bow down to.
Exactly. They said the footstool actually represents Christ's incarnation.
Ah, so God taking on flesh, coming down to earth, that whole thing.
Exactly. Not some fancy ottoman you can pray to.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. But were they just making this up? Did anyone else see it that way?
They actually brought in St. Ambrose to back them up.
Ooh, name dropping. I like it.
Hey, gotta use the big guns sometimes, right?
Sure. Especially with the debate this heated.
And Ambrose had written that by footstool, we should understand it as the flesh of Christ.
Not some literal piece of furniture.
Precisely.
Smart move, bringing in the heavy hitters. Okay, so that's the footstool argument debunked.
Debunked according to them, anyway.
Fair point,
But
fair
yeah.
point. But it's not their only argument. In chapter 9, they bring up King Solomon.
Interesting choice. Given that Solomon's temple was kind of famous for its, shall we say, elaborate decorations,
Yeah, not exactly known for its minimalism, so how do they swing that one around to their side?
it's clever, actually. They use Solomon to talk about the difference between symbolism and idolatry.
Okay, so the oxen and lions Solomon put in the temple, those were symbolic, not meant to be worshipped themselves.
Exactly. They represented God's power, his majesty, all that.
But you're not supposed to, like, pray to the giant golden ox.
Exactly. So the author isn't saying all images are bad.
It's about intention, right, what they're meant for.
Precisely. It's a distinction we still grapple with today.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in our world where we're just bombarded with images constantly.
Right. It makes you wonder what the author would say about that.
I know. Food for thought.
Oh.
But speaking of thought-provoking, there's another tactic they use that I love. Chapter 12, they bring up the parable about hiding your light under a basket.
Oh, I remember that one.
Don't hide your light, let it shine, all that.
Right. But they flip it around and use it against the image supporters.
Oh, how so?
They say those who are like too much on images are the ones hiding their light.
Wow, that's a good point. Like, you're so focused on the outward form, you forget the inner light.
Exactly. True faith is internal, not just about the rituals or the objects you surround yourself with.
Powerful stuff. So we've got biblical interpretation, we've got theological smackdowns, now we've got parable flipping.
They weren't messing around.
Clearly. But it doesn't stop there. They also bring in history to support their argument.
In chapter 13, yeah.
They talk about Pope Sylvester giving images to Emperor Constantine.
Which at first glance seems to go against their whole argument.
Right, like if a pope is giving out images.
Exactly. But they have a twist. They claim Sylvester gave those images as a way to wean Constantine off of pagan idols.
Ah, so it's a stepping stone, not the end goal.
Exactly. Meant to ease the transition to a more spiritual understanding, not replace it entirely.
That's actually really clever when you think about the context. Early Christianity, trying to navigate a world steeped in paganism.
Makes sense that they'd use familiar practices to introduce new ideas.
It's like meeting people where they are, you know?
Right,
Okay,
right.
so we've got history on their side, but what about the theological heavy hitters?
They do bring out the big guns. Augustine, in particular.
Sectors 14 through 16, right. That whole section gets pretty dense.
It does. A lot of back and forth about specific quotes, interpretations.
But there's one Augustine quote that really stands out, right? About the image of God.
Oh, absolutely. Because the pro-image side was all about that Genesis line, right?
Yeah.
God created man in his image.
Using it to justify physical representations.
Exactly. But Augustine argued the image of God isn't about our physical bodies at all.
It's about our souls, our ability to reason, to love, to connect with God.
Exactly. That's what makes us uniquely human, not something you can capture in paint or stone.
Mic drop moment right there. You're looking for God in all the wrong places, guys.
Pretty much. And the
Yeah.
Libri Carolini uses that to really drive home this point. True worship is internal.
Not about the outward display.
Precisely. But it wasn't enough to just quote the big names. They also went to great lengths to discredit any pro-image sources they disagreed with.
Oh, so there was some serious shade being thrown. Give me the details.
Oh yeah, they could get pretty brutal.
So what were they like? Fact-checking your arguments? Please cite your sources?
Basically, they were very particular about who they considered a reliable authority.
Which makes sense, I guess. In the 8th century, you couldn't just Google someone's credentials.
Right. They put a lot of weight on lineage, reputation, that kind of thing.
So if they couldn't vouch for the person making the pro-image argument, it was immediately suspect.
Exactly. It really shows you how much the intellectual landscape has changed since then.
No kidding. But, you know, for all their hardline arguments, the author of the Libri Carolini does acknowledge it wasn't always black and white.
Yeah, in chapter 23, they actually present a more nuanced perspective, that of Pope Gregory the Great.
Gregory the Great. Now, he was a big proponent of images in churches, right? I'm curious to see how they handle this one.
It's interesting because Gregory represents a kind of middle ground in this whole debate.
How so?
Well, he believed images could be useful for teaching, especially for people who couldn't read or understand complex theology.
Okay, so kind of like visual aids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he was very clear that they were not to be worshipped.
Ah, so it's a like don't touch policy for religious art.
Precisely. Appreciate the beauty, learn the stories, but don't bow down and worship.
Which, when you think about it, is pretty much in line with the Libri Carolini's overall message.
Exactly. It's about making that distinction between the representation and the thing itself.
And not letting the representation become an idol in its own right.
Exactly. And I think it's significant that they included Gregory's perspective at all.
It shows they were trying to be fair, to engage with the other side even when they disagreed.
Absolutely. Recognizing that there were valid points to be made on both sides.
It's a good reminder for us today too, right? You can have a nuanced view, acknowledge different perspectives, even in the midst of a heated debate.
Couldn't agree more. But don't worry, they're not going soft on us. After presenting Gregory's view, they jump right back into their arguments against image worship.
Chapters 24 through 26, right?
Yeah.
Back to the theological smackdown.
Pretty much. And they keep hammering home this idea. True worship is for God alone.
Not for things made by human hands.
Exactly. They even bring back that point about God creating humans in his image, not these statues and paintings.
Right. Like, if you're going to venerate something made in God's image, start with each other.
It's a powerful argument. And they also address that comparison to the Ark of the Covenant again.
Which the pro-image side kept bringing up.
Constantly. But the Libri Carolini author shuts it down, saying images are in no way comparable to the Ark.
Which was a sacred object directly associated with God's presence.
Exactly. There's that distinction again, God-made versus human-made.
And the images, no matter how beautiful, fall firmly on the human-made side.
Precisely. And that leads into another important distinction they make in chapter 27, the difference between the Eucharist, the bread and wine, and images.
Okay, interesting comparison. How do they connect those two things?
They argue the Eucharist is unique because it's transformed by God's power.
It's not just bread and wine anymore.
Exactly. It becomes something more, something imbued with divine presence.
Whereas images are just, well, images.
Right. They might be beautiful, they might inspire us, but they don't have that same level of spiritual significance.
It's a powerful distinction. But it's not all theological heavy lifting in these last few chapters. They also dedicate a whole section to the power of the cross.
Ah, yes. Chapter 28, that one always stands out.
They spend a lot of time praising the cross, contrasting its real power with these mere images.
And who better to quote on the topic of the cross than the Apostle Paul himself?
The OG cross enthusiast. I glory in the cross of Christ and all that.
Exactly. They lean heavily on Paul's words to drive home the point. The cross is the ultimate symbol of sacrifice, of triumph over death.
It's not just a pretty decoration.
Not at all. So we've covered a lot of ground here: biblical interpretation, historical analysis, theological smackdowns.
And even some parable flipping along the way. But how does it all end? What's the final word from the Libri Carolini?
Well, they address a few more pro-image arguments in these last few chapters.
Sure.
But the most striking thing, to me, is this. They say it's wrong to curse your ancestors for holding different views on this.
Oh, interesting. It's like they're trying to cool down the temperature a bit.
Right. Reminding everyone that unity doesn't require uniformity.
That we can disagree on certain points and still be united in our faith.
Exactly. And respect those who came before us, even if we don't see eye to eye on everything.
It's a message that feels incredibly relevant today, don't you think? In a world that often seems so divided.
Absolutely.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive into the Libri Carolini has been eye-opening. It's amazing how relevant this 8th century text still feels today.
It really makes you think about the power of images, the importance of intentionality in our spiritual lives.
It really does. And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up here. What would Charlemagne think of our modern world so saturated with images? That's something for all of us to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Book 2 of the Libri Carolini. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.